Sir Edward Heath was buried a national hero. Yet behind closed doors, the former Prime Minister was allegedly the epicenter of the most shocking British gay brothel scandal in history. When detectives finally closed in on Elm Guest House, the state didn't seek justice. Instead, they orchestrated a ruthless MI5 cover-up, systematically shredding the evidence to protect the crown. Sir Edward Heath was heralded across the globe as a distinguished lifelong bachelor, a gentleman whose singular devotion was to his country. But lurking beneath that impeccably tailored righteous facade lies a labyrinth of disturbing allegations regarding a deeply concealed private life. It is a narrative inextricably linked to Elm Guest House, an unassuming address that was allegedly the clandestine rendezvous point for the nation's most untouchable elite. When diligent investigators finally prepared to breach the core of this impenetrable network, an invisible, crushing command descended from the highest echelons of power. MI5 and the elite special branch allegedly intervened with surgical precision, confiscating case files, sealing crucial evidence, and reducing every honest attempt at an investigation to mere dust. Welcome to the anatomy of what might be the most brazen institutional cover-up ever orchestrated from the shadows of number 10 Downing Street, where justice was systematically blockaded by the very architects who swore to uphold it. The underlying darkness of this historical anomaly is rooted in the profound contradictions of Edward Richard George Heath. Known affectionately as Ted Heath, he was not a product of the traditional, inherited aristocratic privilege that often dictates British politics. He clawed his way up from a working-class background, relying on fierce intellect and unyielding discipline to conquer Oxford, serve in the military, and ultimately master the political chessboard. As Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974, he was the chief architect who dragged a reluctant Britain into the European economic community, cementing a monumental legacy that redefined London's standing on the global stage. In the unforgiving public eye, he was the epitome of a disciplined statesman. He was a man of high culture, a gifted musician who conducted symphony orchestras with the same intense, unwavering focus. He applied to parliamentary debates. He never married and had no children. The society of his time did not view this as an oddity, but revered his solitude as the ultimate sacrifice. They firmly believed he was wedded to the empire, pouring every ounce of his energy, passion, and love into the nation. He frequently held audiences with Queen Elizabeth II, holding the political lifeblood of the country in his hands during some of the most paralyzing high-stakes years of the Cold War. When the Queen bestowed upon him the highest order of chivalry, making him a knight companion of the Order of the Garter, it felt like the natural culmination of a life utterly devoid of selfish pursuits. No one in the general public could have fathomed that beneath this flawless armor of dedication lay a gravitational black hole of unanswered questions, personal suffering, and allegations so severe they threatened to shatter the very foundations of the establishment. During the turbulent decades of the 1970s and 1980s, Elm Guest House sat quietly on Rocks Lane in the affluent southwestern London district of Barnes. On the surface, it was a completely unremarkable bed and breakfast, managed by a woman named Carol Cassier. However, according to a cascade of subsequent allegations, whistleblower testimonies, and accounts from survivors that would emerge years later, this establishment was anything but a haven for for weary travelers. It was allegedly operating as a highly exclusive subterranean club, a closely guarded sanctuary for the absolute upper crust of British society. The whispers suggested a clientele composed of towering political figures, influential members of parliament, judges who wielded the scales of justice by day, and high-ranking military brass. In a societal era defined by strict, unforgiving public morality and rigid conservatism, Elm Guest House allegedly served as a lawless gray zone. It was a place where the most powerful men in the country could shed their dignified public masks and indulge in the darkest, most forbidden desires without fear of societal retribution. But the existence of Elm Guest House was not merely a matter of moral decay or hypocritical debauchery. It was a ticking time bomb of national security. Anyone who crossed the threshold of that guest house instantly rendered themselves vulnerable to catastrophic blackmail. In the paranoia-fueled epoch of the Cold War, where espionage was a daily reality, a single sexual secret involving a key government official could easily be traded for classified state intelligence. By the early 1980s, a faction of fiercely dedicated and uncompromising investigators within Scotland Yard began to notice a pattern of disturbing anomalies, fragmented clues gathered from street-level crimes, disjointed testimonies from vulnerable runaway youths, and hushed rumors from the criminal underworld all began to intersect at a single, undeniable coordinate: Elm Guest House. Utilizing rigorous police work, these detectives began mapping the network, quietly gathering physical evidence, and methodically peeling back the innocuous facade of the suburban bed and breakfast. Yet, from their very first probing steps, they hit an invisible, unyielding wall of resistance. The British public was still sleeping soundly, clutching the comforting illusion of an incorruptible political system and a celibate, morally unimpeachable prime minister. The citizens had no idea that active police files were beginning to point directly at men who stood at the absolute zenith of power. The lethal knot began to tighten dramatically when rumors of a VIP list, a ledger allegedly detailing the names, dates, and preferences of the elite clientele who frequented the guest house, fell into the crosshairs of the police. From that exact second, this was no longer a routine vice squad operation. It mutated into a visceral do-or-die war between the blind pursuit of justice and the survival instincts of the supreme ruling class. Sir Edward Heath was no longer just the distinguished former prime minister. In the shadows, he had allegedly become the center of a volatile, explosive inquiry that possessed enough kinetic energy to collapse the entire democratic institution. The existence of Edward Heath during this period was a masterclass in extreme cognitive dissonance, a life violently torn between two completely irreconcilable realities. In the daylight, he commanded absolute authority. He stood confidently outside the iconic black door of number 10 Downing Street, waving to adoring crowds, drafting economic policies that dictated the fates of millions, and sitting shoulder to shoulder with global leaders to navigate the geopolitical minefield of the 20th century. His image, baton in hand, leading a massive symphony orchestra, projected an aura of profound intellectual depth and disciplined grace. But beneath that tranquil, curated surface, a suffocating darkness was metastasizing. The moment he stepped away from the glaring lights of Downing Street, His name was allegedly being whispered in connection with the most horrifying subterranean abuses of power imaginable. This jarring juxtaposition birthed a cruel irony. The man entrusted to steer the nation, the ultimate guardian of British law and order, was being quietly implicated in a lawless, predatory underworld. The rumors began to seep into the hushed corridors of Westminster. Calculating gazes tracked his movements, and the ruthless British tabloid press, always hungry for the scent of blood, began to circle. The tension was an invisible garrote wire, slowly tightening around the neck of the establishment. The boiling point of this silent crisis was reached when the existence of the VIP list at Elm Guest House transitioned from a paranoid rumor to a tangible, terrifying reality for the establishment. In 1982, courageous officers from Scotland Yard launched a decisive raid on the property. They tore through the premises, seizing mountains of documentation, including ledgers and diaries that allegedly contained the names of men who could plunge the United Kingdom into unprecedented political chaos. For the investigators on the ground, this was the holy grail of evidence, the undeniable proof required to drag systemic, institutionalized abuse out into the unforgiving light of day. But for the panicked architects of the state, these seized notebooks represented an immediate death sentence, a catastrophic threat to the stability and credibility of the British government. The detectives prepared to escalate the operation, drafting plans for interrogations, cross-referencing testimonies, and preparing arrest warrants for individuals deemed untouchable. The atmosphere inside the police precincts grew incredibly dense, suffocating under the weight of what they were about to unleash. They were acutely aware they were aiming their weapons at towering giants, but the primal instinct to enforce the law pushed them forward into the dark. The stage was set for what could have been the most monumental, devastating purge in the modern political history of Great Britain. Immediately, the shadow government struck back. MI5 and the Special Branch initiated emergency intervention protocols under the Official Secrets Act. The 1970s and 1980s were defined by Cold War paranoia. Soviet operatives constantly hunted for leverage. A former prime minister compromised by a pedophile ring was a catastrophic national security vulnerability that the KGB could weaponize to fracture NATO. MI5 made a cold, mathematical calculation. The geopolitical stability of the West outweighed the lives of runaway youths. The honest detectives who built the case were suddenly reassigned, their careers derailed. The seized ledgers were forcefully transferred into the hands of specialized intelligence units, transported to secure incineration facilities, and reduced to ash. The investigation was abruptly frozen, officially dismissed as unsubstantiated rumors. Imagine the profound, isolating psychological torture endured by the survivors. They were forced to navigate a reality where their deepest trauma was a fiercely guarded state secret. Every time they turned on a television, they were confronted with the face of the man they feared, smiling amicably, shaking hands with global dignitaries, and lecturing the public on moral fortitude. The suffering of the individual was rendered entirely invisible, swallowed whole by the overwhelming narrative of a great statesman's life. Yet in that silent suffering, there is a fragile, agonizing resilience, the sheer human capacity to endure the weight of an entire government calling you a liar without ever speaking a word. Time, however, is the ultimate enemy of the cover-up. Decades later, as the architects of this silence aged and died, the grip of the state began to loosen. The launch of Operation Conifer in the 2000s was a desperate attempt by a modernizing police force to reckon with the sins of its predecessors. But investigating a crime scene that had been systematically sanitized by the intelligence services 30 years prior was like trying to read a book that had been burned to ash. The detectives of Conifer were not just looking for evidence. They were hunting for the negative space where evidence used to be. They had to trace the outlines of the missing documents, the sudden transfers of personnel, and the unnatural silences in the archives. It was an archaeological excavation of corruption, revealing not the weapon itself, but the undeniable institutional footprint of the hand that hid it. The narrative of Sir Edward Heath and the Elm Guest House is far from a closed chapter. It remains a gaping, unhealed laceration on the body of British justice. It forces a brutal confrontation with the reality that the institutions designed to protect the vulnerable are fully capable of weaponizing their power to protect the monstrous, provided the monster wears the right suit and holds the right office. The investigation may have been officially concluded and the primary suspect may be buried beneath the heavy marble of national veneration. But the echoes of the destroyed files and the silenced voices refuse to fade. They linger in the corridors of power as a permanent warning. The machinery of state preservation is vast, cold, and relentlessly efficient, but it is never completely flawless. It was not a fortress. Elm Guest House was an unremarkable brick building in Barnes, a quiet, affluent suburb where the lawns were meticulously manicured and the silence was absolute. This physical normality was the most grotesque aspect of the operation. The establishment did not hide its darkest secrets in underground bunkers. It hid them in plain sight, protected by the impenetrable shield of middle-class respectability. Young boys, often runaways from the fractured industrial towns of the North, or escapees from the brutal care home system, were allegedly funneled into this quiet street. They carried the fragile beauty of youth, a vulnerability that was systematically targeted, consumed, and discarded. The men who arrived at Rocks Lane did not sneak through the back alleys. They arrived in chauffeur-driven government vehicles, their faces recognizable from the evening news broadcasts. They possessed an arrogance born of absolute impunity. They knew the local constabulary would never dare run a license plate belonging to a member of parliament, a high court judge, or a high-ranking military officer. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to, operating as an exclusive procurement network for the men who wrote the laws. The detectives of Scotland Yard, who initially stumbled upon this network, were not rogue vigilantes. They were seasoned, hardened men who believed in the rigid structure of the law. They possessed a naive, almost tragic faith in the blind scales of justice. When they began connecting the disappearances, the fragmented testimonies, and the sudden influx of illicit money around Barnes, they meticulously built their case. They cataloged the names, the dates, and the undeniable patterns of systemic abuse. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the beast they were hunting. They believed they were investigating a crime syndicate. They did not realize they were investigating the state itself. The retaliation they faced was not a physical assault. It was a bureaucratic annihilation. The intelligence services did not assassinate these detectives. They simply erased their professional existence. It began with the sudden, unexplained audits of their personal lives. Their phones were tapped, their expense reports scrutinized for the slightest infraction, their families subjected to the cold, intimidating gaze of surveillance. The physical evidence, the lifeblood of any criminal prosecution, underwent a terrifying process of state-sponsored alchemy. The ledgers seized from Elm Guest House, the infamous VIP list that contained the names of the British ruling class, did not accidentally catch fire. They were systematically requisitioned under the draconian clauses of the Official Secrets Act. The detectives were ordered to hand over the boxes of evidence to men in unassuming suits who presented credentials from MI5 and the Special Branch. There were no receipts given. There was no chain of custody maintained. The documents were swallowed by the intelligence apparatus, disappearing into classified vacuums without a single receipt or chain of custody. This was the banality of evil in its most modern form. A clerk stamping a classification code on a file that contained the proof of shattered lives, condemning the victims to a lifetime of silent agony while protecting the careers of the perpetrators. The state proved that it could make anything disappear, including the truth. While modern historians and investigative journalists vehemently debate whether the destruction of evidence was a coordinated MI5 operation or a convenient product of chronic bureaucratic incompetence, the result remained identical for the victims: absolute silence. The motivation behind this staggering perversion of justice extended beyond the mere protection of Edward Heath. The 1970s and 1980s were defined by the existential dread of the Cold War. The British establishment was a tightly knit fraternity, heavily populated by men who had attended the same elite public schools and universities. This magic circle operated on a strict code of mutual protection and mutually assured destruction. If one pillar of the establishment fell, the entire structure risked collapse. Intelligence agencies were acutely aware that Soviet operatives were constantly hunting for leverage. A former prime minister compromised by a pedophile ring was not just a domestic scandal, it was a catastrophic national security vulnerability. The KGB would have weaponized that information to fracture the NATO alliance and humiliate the United Kingdom on the global stage. Therefore, MI5 made a cold, calculating decision. They weighed the suffering of anonymous, disposable youths against the geopolitical stability of the Western world. The victims were deemed an acceptable sacrifice. The state did not merely cover up a crime. It actively endorsed the abuse by ensuring its continuation without consequence. As the years bled into decades, the contradiction of Edward Heath's existence grew ever more grotesque. He remained a towering figure in British public life. He sailed his yachts, conducted orchestras, and offered statesman-like commentary on global affairs. He was a frequent guest of honor at state banquets, his chest adorned with medals. For the survivors of Elm Guest House, watching this spectacle was a form of prolonged psychological torture. They were forced to live in a society that aggressively worshipped the man who had allegedly destroyed them. Their trauma was compounded by the gaslighting of an entire nation. When a victim tried to speak out, they were instantly crushed by the weight of libel laws and a hostile press that acted as the Praetorian Guard for the establishment. The fragile beauty of their humanity was ground into the dirt, their voices dismissed as the ravings of opportunists or lunatics. They learned the hardest lesson of all: truth is not an objective reality. It is a narrative dictated by those who hold the power. It was not until 2015, a decade after Heath's lavish state funeral, that the suffocating grip of the establishment finally slipped. Operation Conifer was launched, a massive police inquiry tasked with investigating the historical allegations against the late Prime Minister. But the detectives of Conifer were walking through a graveyard of evidence. They were hunting a ghost. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses, pieced together decades-old testimonies, and scoured archives that had already been methodically purged by their predecessors. They faced the impossible task of proving a negative, of reconstructing a puzzle where the most crucial pieces had been intentionally incinerated 30 years prior. The final report of Operation Conifer was a devastating document, not because it provided absolute closure, but because of what it conceded. The police concluded that the allegations against Heath were so substantial, so persistent, and so geographically widespread that, had he been alive, they would have had no choice but to interrogate him under caution as a criminal suspect. It was a staggering admission of institutional failure, a quiet acknowledgement that the state had spent decades protecting a man who should have been standing in a defendant's dock. The story of Sir Edward Heath is the ultimate indictment of unchecked power. It exposes the terrifying reality that the British establishment was willing to sacrifice its moral core to preserve its image. The legacy of Elm Guest House is not just the trauma of the victims. It is the permanent stain on the institutions that chose silence over justice. The police, the intelligence services, the political class, they all became complicit in the very crimes they were sworn to eradicate. They built a fortress around the Prime Minister, mortaring the bricks with the shattered lives of the vulnerable. And while the man himself has escaped earthly justice, buried with full honors, the shadow he cast over British history continues to lengthen. The cover-up was so comprehensive, so ruthless, that it forces us to question everything we know about the men who ruled the 20th century. If a prime minister could allegedly operate at the center of such darkness, shielded by the full might of the state, what else has been buried? What other monsters have been eulogized as heroes? A monster condemned in the darkest corners of the surviving underground, as a ruthless abuser who shattered the minds and bodies of the most vulnerable citizens. A hero receiving a state funeral draped in the Union Jack, mourned by monarchs, and forever immortalized in bronze and marble. He is Sir Edward Heath. How can a society demand unwavering legal compliance from its ordinary citizens while simultaneously building golden altars to the very men accused of orchestrating its most horrific violations? A cover-up of this magnitude could only be successfully executed and maintained within the suffocating climate of the United Kingdom during the early 1970s. This was not an era of stable, confident governance. Britain was tearing itself apart at the seams. The economy was completely paralyzed by massive miners' strikes, forcing the government to implement the infamous 3-day week, where electricity was rationed, and businesses were forced to operate in the dark. Inflation was skyrocketing. On top of the economic devastation, the brutal violence of the Troubles was spilling over from Northern Ireland, with the IRA executing terrifying bombing campaigns right in the heart of London. The British establishment was gripped by an existential terror. They genuinely believed the fabric of their society was disintegrating. In this atmosphere of absolute panic, the intelligence services and the political elite viewed any internal scandal not as a matter of criminal justice, but as a fatal blow to national survival. The state was a wounded animal, and a wounded animal will crush anything that threatens it, no matter how fragile or innocent. It was within this crucible of national desperation that the alleged activities at Elm Guest House became a matter of supreme state security. MI5, led during Heath's tenure by figures deeply entrenched in the traditional establishment, did not look at a prime minister compromised by unspeakable appetites and see a criminal who needed to be arrested. They saw a catastrophic vulnerability that needed to be managed, contained, and potentially leveraged. In the ruthless calculus of intelligence work, a leader with a profound dark secret is a leader who can be controlled. The security apparatus was entirely focused on the geopolitical chessboard, ensuring that Soviet intelligence did not acquire the ultimate piece of blackmail material. The boys who were allegedly procured from care homes and railway stations were not factored into this equation. Their suffering, their psychological destruction, and the fragile beauty of their stolen youth were considered entirely irrelevant. They were the silent disposable fuel burned to keep the machinery of the state running smoothly. The mechanics of silencing the victims required a psychological warfare campaign waged against the public. The establishment utilized its tight-knit relationships with the media barons of Fleet Street to ensure that any whisper of Elm Guest House was immediately dismissed as the delirious ravings of conspiracy theorists or the malicious lies of political opponents. Defamation laws in the United Kingdom were and remain heavily skewed in favor of the wealthy and powerful. If a survivor ever attempted to approach a journalist, the immediate threat of ruinous legal action was deployed like a weapon of mass destruction. This created an airtight echo chamber of manufactured innocence. The survivors were forced to watch their alleged tormentor govern the country, dictate morality, and receive the adoration of the masses. This profound gaslighting inflicts a unique kind of psychological trauma. It isolates the victim entirely, making them question their own sanity and worth. When the entire apparatus of your country tells you that your pain does not exist, the human mind begins to collapse under the weight of the contradiction. Yet, the absolute monopoly the establishment held over information began to fracture with the turn of the millennium. The advent of the internet dismantled the traditional gatekeepers of the British press. Survivors, whistleblowers, and retired police officers who had been carrying the heavy burden of these secrets for decades finally found a platform where they could speak without the immediate threat of a libel writ landing on their doorstep. Fragmented stories began to coalesce on obscure forums, matching dates, names, and the specific operational details of Elm Guest House. The sheer volume of these independent testimonies, originating from people who had never met each other, created a terrifying mosaic that the state could no longer simply ignore or litigate out of existence. The wall of silence, built with the bricks of intimidation and the mortar of state secrets, finally began to show deep structural cracks. This unbearable public pressure ultimately forced the hand of the authorities, leading to the creation of Operation Conifer in 2015. Wiltshire Police, the force responsible for the jurisdiction where Heath lived his final years, took on the monumental and politically explosive task of investigating a dead prime minister. Chief Constable Mike Veal, the man who led the inquiry, stepped into a crossfire that would ultimately destroy his own career. Veal was not investigating a simple historical crime. He was investigating the history of the British establishment itself. The moment he publicly stated that the allegations against Heath were serious and required thorough investigation, the system turned on him with the exact same ferocity it had unleashed on the Scotland Yard detectives in the 1980s. The backlash was immediate, coordinated, and brutal. High-ranking conservative politicians, loyalist biographers, and right-wing media outlets launched a relentless smear campaign against Veal and his investigation. They accused him of wasting millions of pounds of taxpayer money on a witch hunt against a defenseless, honorable statesman. They ridiculed the surviving victims, demanding impossible standards of proof for crimes that the state had spent decades deliberately covering up. This reaction perfectly illustrated the very mechanism of the Elm Guest House cover-up operating in broad daylight. The establishment was not interested in the truth. They were interested in protecting the sanctity of their historical narrative. Veal was subjected to intense professional scrutiny, his character assassinated in the daily papers, proving that even in the modern era, challenging the legacy of supreme power carries a devastating personal cost. Despite the overwhelming hostility, Operation Conifer pushed forward, interviewing hundreds of individuals and navigating the deliberate voids left in the National Archives. They uncovered a harrowing pattern of alleged abuse that spanned decades and stretched across multiple counties. The investigation revealed instances where individuals had attempted to report Heath to the authorities in the 1990s, only to have their complaints mysteriously dropped or mishandled by the police. It highlighted the terrifying reality that the shield of impunity extended long after Heath had left Number 10. The system was programmed to protect him unconditionally. The fragile human experience of the victims, marked by addiction, severe mental health crises, and suicide, stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the comfortable, heavily protected retirement of the man they accused. When the final report of Operation Conifer was published, it walked a precarious tightrope. It could not definitively convict a dead man, nor could it completely exonerate him. But the subtext of the official findings was a devastating indictment of the British state. By concluding that the evidence was strong enough to warrant interviewing a former prime minister under caution, the police effectively validated the core narrative of the survivors. They confirmed that the smoke billowing from Elm Guest House for decades was indeed hiding a massive institutional fire. The cover-up had successfully run the clock out on legal justice, ensuring Heath would never face a jury. But the historical record had been irrevocably altered. The perfectly tailored suit of the distinguished statesman was finally stripped away, revealing the terrifying silhouette of a system that prioritized its own survival over the lives of its citizens. The architecture of this prolonged deception extended far beyond the immediate actions of the police and intelligence services. It relied heavily on the deliberate complicity of the British press. During the height of the Elm Guest House operations in the 1970s and 1980s, Fleet Street was not the aggressive, scandal-hungry beast it is today when dealing with the political elite. There existed a profound, almost paralyzing culture of deference toward the ruling class. The editors of major national newspapers were members of the exact same exclusive clubs as the politicians they were supposed to scrutinize. They dined together, attended the same elite functions, and shared a fundamental belief that the stability of the nation relied on maintaining the unblemished image of its leaders. When rumors of Edward Heath's alleged dark appetites began to circulate through the whispered networks of journalists, they were not met with investigative fervor. They were met with an impenetrable wall of deliberate blindness. The press, which is supposed to act as the ultimate safeguard of a democracy, willingly transformed itself into the public relations arm of a corrupt establishment. The mechanism the state used to legally enforce this silence was the D-Notice system, formerly known as the Defense and Security Media Advisory Notice. In theory, a D-Notice is an official request to news editors not to publish or broadcast items on specified subjects for reasons of national security. In practice, during the Cold War era, it was frequently weaponized as an absolute gag order. If an ambitious reporter stumbled upon the connection between the VIP lists at Elm Guest House and number 10 Downing Street, a quiet phone call from Whitehall to the editor's desk was all it took to kill the story permanently. The intelligence services did not need to threaten journalists with physical harm. They simply invoked the terrifying specter of the Official Secrets Act. A journalist who pushed too hard would find themselves completely frozen out of Westminster, their career effectively destroyed overnight. This insidious system ensured that the horrifying reality of what was happening in suburban London remained entirely quarantined from the public consciousness. This media blackout relied heavily on the brutal class divide that defined British society. The victims of Elm Guest House were not the sons of lawyers, bankers, or politicians. They were the discarded children of the working class, often runaways, orphans, or wards of a deeply flawed state care system. They possessed no social capital, no financial resources, and absolutely no voice. The establishment understood that if it came down to the word of a deeply traumatized street youth against the word of a former prime minister, the public, guided by the complicit press, would invariably side with power. The fragile beauty of these young lives was systematically commodified and consumed by men who viewed themselves as untouchable gods. The state actively participated in this dehumanization by ensuring that the victims were framed as unreliable, degenerate, and inherently dishonest. Whenever a survivor attempted to approach the authorities or the media, their personal histories were ruthlessly weaponized against them. Minor criminal records born of poverty or desperate survival tactics were used to completely discredit their testimonies about systemic abuse. The psychological toll on these survivors is a tragedy that no official report can ever fully quantify. As they aged, they were forced to navigate a world that openly celebrated their alleged abuser. Edward Heath spent his retirement years in sheer luxury in Salisbury, residing in a magnificent Georgian townhouse situated in the Cathedral Close. He was surrounded by priceless art, grand pianos, and the constant adulation of conservative loyalists. In stark contrast, the individuals who claimed he had destroyed their lives were often battling severe addiction, profound mental health crises, and the crushing weight of lifelong poverty. The establishment's cover-up was not a victimless administrative maneuver. It was a continuing act of violence that perpetuated the suffering of the survivors every single day of their lives. To be told by your government that your trauma is a lie, to watch the machinery of justice actively shield the monster in your nightmares, is to experience a total collapse of human trust. Furthermore, the Elm Guest House was not an isolated anomaly. As the decades passed and the suffocating grip of the D-notices finally began to weaken, it became increasingly apparent that the establishment had been protecting a vast interconnected network of abuse. Elm Guest House was merely one node in a terrifying web that allegedly included other notorious locations like Dolphin Square and various private residences across London. The state apparatus had not simply intervened to save Edward Heath. It had intervened to protect dozens of high-ranking figures who were deeply embedded in this predatory culture. The VYP list that MI5 allegedly shredded did not just contain one name. It was a roadmap to the very heart of British political and judicial power. The intelligence services knew that pulling one thread would unravel the entire sweater, exposing a level of institutional corruption that would permanently destroy the public's faith in the government. Therefore, the cover-up was absolute, ruthless, and entirely unapologetic. Despite the billions of pounds and the thousands of hours the state invested in burying the truth, they failed to account for the relentless, agonizing persistence of human memory. You cannot shred a memory. You cannot issue a D-notice to a nightmare. The survivors, though broken and marginalized, refused to simply disappear into the shadows as the state had planned. They carried the heavy, dangerous truth with them, passing it along to trusted advocates, support workers, and eventually a new generation of digital journalists who were not bound by the old boys club rules of Fleet Street. The dam that the establishment had built with intimidation and secrecy slowly began to crack under the immense pressure of undeniable accumulated human suffering. The era of unquestioning deference was ending, replaced by a deep, cynical distrust of authority that had been earned through decades of state-sponsored lies. The legacy of Sir Edward Heath was no longer secure behind the heavy oak doors of power. It was finally being dragged out into the unforgiving light of the modern era. For decades, the invisible fortress constructed around the British establishment appeared absolutely impenetrable. The architects of the Elm Guest House cover-up had gambled on the premise that time would simply erase the crimes. They believed that as the victims aged and died in poverty, and as the physical paper trails were systematically turned to ash, the allegations would naturally evaporate into the realm of baseless folklore. They almost succeeded, but history possesses a terrifying habit of unearthing that which the state desperately wishes to keep buried. The seismic shift did not begin with Edward Heath. It began with the exposure of another supposedly untouchable British icon, a man who had used the veil of philanthropy and massive public adoration to mask a prolific, monstrous reality. When the dam finally broke regarding the systemic, decades-long abuses committed by prominent television personalities and individuals with direct keys to the highest corridors of power, the British public experienced a violent collective awakening. The impossible was suddenly exposed as terrifyingly commonplace. The protective spell of deference that had shielded the elite for a century was shattered overnight. This profound cultural reckoning sent shockwaves of absolute panic through the hushed halls of Whitehall and the fortified headquarters of the intelligence services. The establishment realized with dawning horror that the public was no longer willing to blindly accept the polished state-sanctioned narratives of their leaders. The exposure of widespread institutional complicity in other high-profile scandals fundamentally altered the lens through which the Elm Guest House rumors were viewed. What was once easily dismissed by Fleet Street editors as the delirious ravings of politically motivated conspiracy theorists was suddenly re-evaluated as a highly plausible, terrifying reality. The sheer audacity of the alleged cover-up, the involvement of MI5, the special branch, and the highest echelons of the police force, no longer sounded like the plot of a paranoid thriller. It sounded exactly like the standard operating procedure of a panicked, self-preserving government operating in the shadows of the Cold War. The state could no longer simply ignore the survivors, because the public was finally primed to listen to the horrifying truth. When Operation Conifer was inevitably forced into existence by this overwhelming tide of public outrage, the modern detectives assigned to the case found themselves stepping into a meticulously sanitized crime scene. They were not fighting a living suspect. They were fighting the ghosts of their own predecessors. The investigation was an exercise in agonizing frustration. When detectives formally requested archival files pertaining to the original 1980s Scotland Yard inquiries into Elm Guest House, they were frequently met with chilling bureaucratic dead ends. Crucial documents were officially listed as lost, accidentally destroyed during routine administrative purges, or entirely missing from the national registries without a single trace of explanation. This absence of evidence was not a result of incompetence. It was the undeniable footprint of a highly organized state-sponsored eradication program. The intelligence agencies had done their jobs perfectly decades prior. They had left the modern police force with nothing but whispers, shadows, and the overwhelming task of proving a massive negative against a deceased head of state. The psychological burden placed on these contemporary investigators was immense. They were forced to confront the brutal reality that the institution they served, the uniform they wore, had been actively weaponized to facilitate and protect the abuse of vulnerable children. They had to sit across the table from aging survivors, men whose lives had been entirely derailed by addiction and trauma, and ask them to relive their deepest nightmares for an institution that had previously called them liars. The detectives had to acknowledge the total betrayal of the badge. The system had operated as a procurement and protection racket for the powerful, utilizing the immense authority of the law to crush the very citizens it was sworn to defend. This realization brought a profound, sickening clarity to the investigation. They were no longer just trying to determine if Edward Heath was guilty. They were meticulously documenting the exact mechanics of how a democratic government successfully suffocates justice to protect its own image. The physical erasure of the crime scene mirrored the administrative erasure of the evidence. Elm Guest House itself underwent a profound transformation over the decades. The unremarkable brick building and barns was eventually sold, renovated, and absorbed back into the pristine, gentrified landscape of affluent suburban London. The physical walls that had allegedly witnessed the most depraved acts of the British elite were painted over, the grounds landscaped, the heavy silence replaced by the mundane sounds of wealthy domesticity. This aggressive gentrification acted as a secondary structural cover-up. It physically scrubbed the stain from the map. You could walk past the address today and have absolutely no idea that you were standing on the epicenter of a geopolitical scandal, a place where the lives of disposable youth were allegedly traded for the fleeting pleasures of men who dictated the fate of the nation. The blood had been washed from beneath the pristine lawns, but the geographical coordinates remained a permanent silent monument to the victims, who were never allowed to speak. For the survivors, the final chapter of this saga was not defined by the satisfying bang of a judge's gavel. They understood with agonizing clarity that legal justice would permanently elude them. Edward Heath had successfully run out the clock, escaping the humiliation of a courtroom and taking his secrets with him to a heavily guarded grave. The battle for these survivors was no longer about securing a criminal conviction. It was a desperate, exhausting fight for historical truth. They fought to ensure that the permanent record reflected their suffering, to force the state to acknowledge that the majestic legacy of the Prime Minister was built upon their broken bodies. In this relentless pursuit, there emerged a fragile, profound beauty. It was the beauty of human resilience, the sheer, undeniable power of marginalized voices refusing to be erased by the colossal machinery of a hostile government. Their solidarity became their only sanctuary in a society that had systematically abandoned them. The ultimate contradiction of this entire narrative rests in the twilight years of Sir Edward Heath himself. He lived out his final decades in an atmosphere of absolute serenity and profound privilege in Salisbury. He hosted elegant dinners, listened to his beloved classical music, and enjoyed the unwavering respect of his peers and the public. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by comfort, completely insulated from the chaotic, devastating wreckage he allegedly left behind. This peaceful passing is the final, most brutal injustice of the Elm Guest House story. It starkly highlights the terrifying reality that the universe does not inherently bend toward justice. Sometimes the architects of profound suffering are allowed to bask in the warm glow of societal reverence until their final breath. The system worked flawlessly for the man it was designed to protect, while completely destroying the individuals it was designed to ignore. The lingering, terrifying question that hangs over the British establishment is not merely what Edward Heath did in the dark, but who else the state is currently protecting with that exact same ruthless efficiency. The final reckoning of the Elm Guest House scandal is not merely an autopsy of a single corrupted politician. It is a terrifying diagnostic of an entire civilization's moral decay. When a government decides that the preservation of its own image is inherently more valuable than the physical and psychological safety of its citizens, it ceases to be a democracy. It transforms into a predatory machine. The cover-up engineered by MI5, the special branch, and the upper echelons of Whitehall was an act of bureaucratic violence unparalleled in modern British history. They did not just hide a crime, they institutionalized it. By actively crushing the Scotland Yard detectives who dared to approach the truth, and by systematically vaporizing the VIP lists that held the key to an unprecedented network of abuse, the state sent a chilling, undeniable message to the elite. You are above the law, and your darkest appetites will be heavily subsidized by the silence of the oppressed. The tragic irony of this colossal deception is that the intelligence apparatus fundamentally miscalculated the true cost of their actions. They believed they were extinguishing a localized fire to save the geopolitical structure of the West during the Cold War. In reality, they were planting a slow-acting poison directly into the bedrock of British society. The immediate scandal of a disgraced prime minister would have been a humiliating, devastating blow to the Conservative Party and the establishment. However, democracies are theoretically designed to withstand and cleanse themselves of internal corruption. By choosing the path of absolute ruthless suppression, the state guaranteed a far more lethal outcome: the permanent, irreversible destruction of public trust. When the populace finally realized that the police force could be commanded to shred evidence and that the press could be ordered to look away, the social contract evaporated. The enduring legacy of Edward Heath is not the European Economic Community. It is the terrifying, pervasive cynicism that now defines the relationship between the British public and their rulers. We must look unflinchingly at the disparity of outcomes that define this narrative, for it perfectly encapsulates the ruthlessness of unchecked power. Consider the final days of the individuals involved. Sir Edward Heath spent his twilight years in the idyllic, sunlit cathedral close of Salisbury. He was a man insulated by extreme wealth, protected by loyal aides, and surrounded by the tangible rewards of a life spent at the pinnacle of human influence. He passed from this world in absolute peace, his reputation officially intact, his name etched into the grand narrative of the 20th century. He never faced a single day in a courtroom. He never had to look into the eyes of the people who accused him of monstrous acts. The state had built a fortress around him that held firm until his last breath. Now juxtapose that serene departure with the agonizing reality of the survivors. For them, the Elm Guest House was not a fleeting political scandal. It was a permanent, inescapable prison sentence. They lived out their days in a society that actively celebrated the architect of their ruin. Their trauma was compounded every single time they saw his face on television, every time they walked past a building named in his honor. Many of these victims did not survive the silence. They were consumed by the severe mental health crises, the addiction, and the overwhelming despair that naturally follows when the entire apparatus of the state dedicates itself to proving that your suffering is a lie. Their lives were treated as completely disposable, brushed away like dust off the immaculate tailoring of the British establishment. The true horror of this story is not just that the crimes allegedly occurred, it is that the system functioned exactly as it was designed to. It protected the powerful and crushed the weak with terrifying efficiency. The publication of the Operation Conifer report in the modern era served as a hollow, agonizing form of vindication. By acknowledging that the sheer volume and credibility of the allegations would have necessitated interrogating Heath as a criminal suspect, the police force finally, quietly admitted the truth. But this admission came decades too late. It was a post-mortem of justice, You cannot prosecute a ghost, and you cannot retroactively heal the generations of trauma inflicted by the state's deliberate silence. The report stands as a stark, depressing monument to the limitations of historical accountability. It proves that while the truth may eventually claw its way out of the darkness, it often arrives long after the perpetrators have escaped consequence, offering nothing but cold comfort to the victims, whose lives were already reduced to ash. As we close the book on this dark chapter, the physical remnants of the scandal have been entirely erased. The building in Barnes has been assimilated back into mundane suburban life. The shredded documents have long since decomposed in classified landfills. The men in the unassuming suits who facilitated the cover-up have quietly retired on generous state pensions, but the shadow cast by number 10 Downing Street has never been darker. The Elm Guest House affair ripped the mask off the British establishment, revealing a monstrous, unfeeling machinery operating just beneath the surface of democratic civility. It forces every citizen to carry a chilling, unresolved doubt regarding the true nature of the people who govern them. If the entire weight of the state could be mobilized to protect one man's unimaginable secrets, the foundation of the law is nothing more than an illusion designed to keep the powerless in check. Yet, as we stare into the abyss left behind by Sir Edward Heath, we realize that the labyrinth of power is vast, and its secrets are deeply interconnected. Heath was a titan of the conservative establishment, heavily shielded by the traditional institutions of the right. But the terrifying reality of supreme power is that corruption does not recognize political boundaries. It infects every corner of the ideological spectrum. Across the aisle, hidden within the complex, fractured history of the Labour Party, lies another towering figure. A prime minister whose sudden, shocking resignation remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in modern political history. A man who was allegedly paranoid that the very same intelligence agencies that protected Heath were actively plotting to destroy him. Or perhaps they were covering up something entirely different, something even more dangerous to the fabric of the nation. The machinery of state secrecy never truly powers down. It simply selects a new target. Do you believe the establishment only harbored one monster, or are you prepared to uncover what lies buried beneath the legacy of the opposition? When the entire apparatus of a democratic state systematically incinerates evidence, silences victims, and weaponizes the law to transform a monstrous predator into a celebrated national hero who truly remains the greatest threat to the survival of the people.